Hello, my name is Julian Elston and I'm an embedded researcher at Plymouth City Council based in the Health Determinants Research Collaboration. And I'm also a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Plymouth. This presentation provides an introduction as to how you might go about analysing qualitative data with a focus on analysing open questions in surveys such as the Council's Electoral Cycle Survey recently conducted. This presentation aims to provide you with an introduction to the principles and practices of qualitative data analysis, providing an analytical example conducted in Excel using open questions drawn from the Council survey on electoral cycles. However, much of the content could be applied to interview transcripts that you might have from conducting other work, for example, using open appreciative inquiry to do interviews on service evaluation. We will explore the different approaches to qualitative research and what good practice looks like. We'll have a go at analysing, coding and feeding some responses to the Council survey on annual electoral cycles, and reflect on your role in data collection and analysis and the influence it might have had on coding and interpreting the data. First of all, I think it's helpful just to reflect on what qualitative data is. It can take many forms, from textual data, text, documents, to images such as photos of people or places, paintings or maps, to audio, people speaking, music or sounds of animals, birdsong or humpback whales even, to artifacts, tools or decorative objects. We are focusing on textual data in this presentation that has been collected in the survey using open questions. That is, questions that don't prompt the person answering to respond yes or no, but rather ask them to describe the how, why, or what of a topic. That said, many of the principles and approaches used to analyze qualitative data, particularly textual data, will be similar. At this stage, I think it might be helpful to ask, why is collecting qualitative data useful? Why should we include open questions in surveys, for example, to collect data? How can it help us address our evaluation or research questions? Well, it can help us with the what, how, and why questions, rather than those relating to how much or how often, or if there's a statistical correlation or the cause-effect relationship between data variables. Qualitative data can help us capture and understand the complexities of human behavior and thought. It can give us a more in-depth understanding of the subject being studied, providing additional insights that we can't get from analysing numbers. It can also help inform new concepts or theories in relation to our topic of interest. It's also worth mentioning at this point that the nature of qualitative research is somewhat different to quantitative research in a number of different ways. In its emphasis on understanding behaviour in its everyday context, so not in a lab, for example. This is called naturalism and might involve observing someone doing their job or taking a particular activity, perhaps even doing it with them. It also involves interpretation, which is often concerned with people's perceptions of what is happening and why, so how they interpret events and make sense of the world. Qualitative research also sees social life as a process, and how people act or behave, their attitudes and values, needs to be understood when people's lives, stories, or their biography, for instance, how they are brought or what is brought up or what has happened to them since. In this way, it is also interested in the nature of interaction. How is this negotiated and its influence on individuals, whether service users or council staff? And finally, it's concerned with relativism. That is, that different people likely have different perspectives on the same interaction or event, or how they perceive or manage and negotiate a council service, for example. Indeed, even in social science, there are different perspectives or theories of knowledge, such as phenomenology, ethnography, constructivism, or critical realism, that can vary in relation to these dimensions discussed so far and others. Perspectives are important to researchers, as this will influence which methodological approach and approach to data collection and analytical methods they might use in their work. Unlike quantitative data collection or research, which often collects data from specific groups of people or a representative sample of a population, sometimes weighted to make sure minority groups are sufficiently represented, so we can get meaningful results that are generalizable to other populations. In qualitative research, such an approach to data collection is often not appropriate. This is because questions being asked are not about how much or how frequent a viewpoint or perspective or behavior is, but rather to understand the range of viewpoints, perspectives, and behaviors that people have. Here are some common approaches often used to collect qualitative data. First up is convenience sampling, which is what it says it is. A sample is easily accessed and close to hand. So, for example, a sample of people coming and going from a supermarket. This method of sampling is not generally recommended unless totally unavoidable. Purposive sampling is when participants are only selected if they are likely to yield rich information for in-depth study. The sample size and participant characteristics will depend on the purpose of the study. Theoretical sampling, on the other hand, is when participants are selected in order to test or develop an emerging theory. As the theory develops or is refined, different types of participant may be appropriate. Maximum variation sampling is when participants are selected in order to provide a sample that is as diverse as possible on the basis of one or more specific characteristics. And so that might relate to age, sex, gender, ethnicity, or some other characteristic of the individual. Snowball sampling is when participants are selected on the basis of an introduction or a recommendation from other participants in the study. This approach can be useful for groups who are difficult to access or have low levels of trust in services or authority, for example, due to marginalization, stigmatization, or discrimination. In this presentation, our qualitative data is coming from open questions in a web-based survey targeted at local residents in 2024 and asks them about what they think of the annual electoral cycle compared to holding a 4-yearly electoral cycle and why. It was promoted by the Council for a month using a variety of means such as local newspapers, social media, posters in public places and emails sent to all residents on the electoral register as well as to specific stakeholder groups. So in terms of advertising the survey, it sought to raise awareness by drawing a number of different sampling strategies to ensure variation: purposive, convenience, and snowballing. For example, using targeted emails known to known interest groups. Although ultimately, the sample required having some sort of computer skills and online access to complete it. Therefore, the data collected relates to those people who are motivated enough to respond to the adverts, perhaps because they had a good or bad experience with using or accessing council services. This means that the views expressed in the survey are unlikely to be representative of all Plymouth residents and therefore may present a biased picture of residents' views. That said, this is a qualitative piece of research or analysis, so we're not interested in the representativeness of their opinions so much, but more the diversity of opinions. So how might we approach analysing the data we've collected from our survey or from interviews or for some other source of qualitative data? Broadly, there are two main approaches to analysing qualitative data and quantitative data for that matter, although in reality, in qualitative analysis, we often employ both approaches. These are abductive and inductive approaches to analysis. A deductive approach is when we identify a relevant theory or hypothesis and then analyse or test the data we have collected to see if it supports or contradicts our theory or hypothesis. Usually we may have collected specific types of data with this task in mind. Based on the findings, we then confirm, refine or reject the theory. Often in qualitative analysis, this means bringing predefined categories or frameworks through which the data is examined, and for this reason it might be called top-down. In direct contrast, inductive analysis is an approach where you start with your data and then develop broader generalizations, patterns or theories from them. So you look for recurring ideas, concepts or relationships, group these into similar patterns and then into broader categories. From these you construct explanation or theory. In this sense, analysis is bottom-up, as what you see in the data then drives the categories you identify and any interrelationships you see to provide an explanation of the data. In practice, though, we may well move between the two, starting perhaps with preconceived ideas about what data we need to collect and the categories of answer we might expect to find, but then find the existing categories don't fit with the patterns in the data we are seeing. So the theory then has to be adapted inductively. Another approach is called abduction, a form of logical reasoning where we start with an observational set of observations and then seek the most likely explanation. It's often described as inference to the best explanation and involves deductive and inductive reasoning, where new theories based on surprising research evidence, which ultimately leads the researcher away from old ideas to new insights coded into a new adapted theory. This is shown in the diagram below. So we've talked about theory of qualitative data analysis, but what does good look like in practice, and what would the signs of good quality analysis be? There is much debate about how to assess the quality of qualitative research. Here are some common points that are identified in the literature, but whether they all apply to all studies may depend on the methods and perspectives taken. How many are employed and whether or not they have been employed to a satisfactory degree is a matter of judgment. So, let's take respondent validation. This is where analysis is validated by participants in the research who recognize their description or interpretation of events, behavior, or meanings in the investigator's findings. Another quality marker is triangulation. This term relates to bringing together different data sources and measurement processes to add greater certainty to your understanding or interpretation of the data and reducing the scope for misinterpreting what has been seen in the data. In practice, where there is one data source, this might mean 2 or 3 people analysing the data independently, checking each other's interpretation or coding, identifying and resolving differences between them. The third point is clear exposition of the data collection. This relates to giving an adequate account of how access was gained and the data produced. This is important as it might influence what data is collected and how. Where there is low levels of trust, for example, people may not give truthful answers to the researcher's questions. So this is an important consideration when interpreting the data and its meaning. Another marker is clear exposition of data analysis. This relates to the nature and quality of the process that is used to organize and interpret the data in the conclusions, and that they are justified in the data, for example, by using quotes that support your insights. Attention to negative cases. Well, this is about the conscientious search and the presentation of cases that are inconsistent with the emerging analysis. This is important to understand because it's important to understand why there are negative cases and what reasons they might be for this. This can aid with modifying your hypothesis. Fair dealing is it's important to give attention to a variety of perspectives offered by different groups of people in your data. In qualitative analysis, there is no one definitive truth or answer, just different perspectives. The aim is therefore to understand this variety. And finally, reflexivity is a key aspect of any qualitative research and analysis. We'll look at this and talk about it a little bit more in depth next. Reflexivity refers to the practice of researchers critically examining how their own background, assumptions, positioning, and presence influences the research process, from the framing of the research question to data collection, analysis, and interpretation. In this sense, it is acknowledgement of the impossibility of remaining outside of one's subject matter, i.e., a misconception that you can be objective in that. We all have our own values, experiences, interests, beliefs, political commitments, life aims, and social identities that play out in the research that we do, whether we are conscious of them or not. So we need to be mindful of our own a priori assumptions that may have shaped what is collected and how it is analysed. How has our presence in the research setting contributed to the nature and content of the data collected, for example? How has the research affected or changed us? So it's important to recognise that data is not simply collected, but co-produced, and interpretations are shaped by the researcher's worldview and theoretical perspective. In this, it's important to recognise our positionality. That is, acknowledging your identity, so your gender, your class, your ethnicity, or your institutional affiliation, just to name several, and how that might shape your interactions with participants in the research and interpretations of the data you collect. So reflexivity includes reflecting on the power relations between researchers and participants, especially in qualitative and participatory research. Demonstrating this self-awareness helps the readers to assess the validity and trustworthiness of your findings that you are presenting. As you might imagine by now, there are a number of different approaches to analysing qualitative data, but these four are probably the most common. Firstly, there's thematic analysis. This is sometimes also referred to as thematic content analysis. As the name suggests, this is an analysis of the content of the data, categorizing common and recurring themes that appear in the data. It reports the key elements of respondents' accounts, and it generally leads to a descriptive summary of the findings in the form of main themes. Another frequent or common approach is the framework approach. This is a more structured approach, originally developed at the National Centre for Social Research to generate policy and practice relevant findings. It's a method which involves summarising and classifying the data within a pre-identified relevant thematic framework. In this sense, it's more deductive in orientation compared to, say, thematic analysis, which tends to be more inductive in nature. The next approach, sometimes seen, is narrative and biographical approaches. And these consider how individual stories are told and by what these stories mean in the social context of people's lives. Finally, we'll say a few words about grounded theory. Though not linear and inductive in approach to analysis, that it seeks to generate theory from data instead of imposing theory upon data. So it specifies a particular steps to achieving this, and these steps allow the researchers to build new data-driven explanations for how and why social processes occur, making it especially valuable for studying unexplored complex topics. However, this term is often one of the most abused phrases in qualitative research literature, as many researchers claim to be using grounded theory when all they have done is a rather superficial thematic content analysis. For the purposes of this presentation, we will focus on how to do thematic analysis. This is because it's a very common approach for analysing qualitative data and likely to be the most relevant approach to your work in the local authority. This next session looks at how to do thematic analysis in more detail. We'll draw on the work of Braun and Clark and more recently the work of Naeem, who outline the following 6 steps to analysis. So the first step is transcribing the data to text. If, for example, it's an interview, and then familiarizing yourself with the text. And by that, I mean reading it several times through, so you really get a good handle on the content. Step 2 is selecting key repetitive words or ideas that emerge from the text, or similar quotations or idea that appear. Step 3 is assigning a name or a code to these repetitive words or phrases. And in step 4, we start to collate those codes that we have named in the text to develop themes by selecting similar codes together and putting them into a theme that seems to make sense, in which we can put them into the same bag, if you like, as they are conceptually similar. Step 5 is linking, connecting and grouping our themes together into concepts or ideas. And finally, step 6 is the development of a conceptual or perhaps a theoretical framework or model that helps us make sense of all the data we have, i.e. by linking and ordering themes or ideas to help us explain what the data says. For example, how people might understand a social issue or explain their behaviour. This is a visual summary of that process, whereby similar, repetitive or distinctive words or phrases are coded up and then grouped into themes, assigned a name that captures the essence of that theme, and then these are linked into concepts, which then might be represented as a conceptual model. So looking at the slide, you can see keywords identified in the text. These are coded up in the ovals. Then like or similar codes are grouped into themes that make sense, and then the themes may be brought together into a concept or conceptual framework on the right. This figure, taken from a paper by Naeem and colleagues, demonstrates the process I just outlined before in a bit more detail, using data from the study on the role of social media and misinformation and rumours during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here you can see how they've taken a word such as risk, highlighted in yellow, or a phrase such as cost of illness, and coded it up with a name that tries to capture its essence. In this case, cost, as shown over here. Later on, this code is linked to a theme called perceived consequences, which forms part of a conceptualized model for understanding how social media influence people's interpretation of the risks and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So just reviewing the steps involved in thematic analysis again, as advocated by Braun and Clark. The first step is familiarizing yourself with the data, so transcribing the data if necessary, reading it, rereading the data, noting down initial ideas. The next step is generating initial codes. Codes relate to interesting features of the data and doing that in a systematic fashion across the entire data set, collating data relevant to each code, naming and describing what's in your code so others can understand and potentially code into it as well. Searching for themes, so you're collating your codes into potential themes, gathering all the relevant data to each potential theme. So typically codes have a similarity. In the previous case, that might relate to the cost, whether that's cost in terms of risk or cost in terms of finance, in terms of going shopping, as in the Naeem case in the previous framework. We then want to review the themes. So reviewing themes, checking if the themes work in relation to the coded extracts, and then the entire data set, generating a thematic map of the analysis. We might want to try moving themes around and linking themes in a way that makes sense to us and the data. Step 5 then is defining and naming themes, ongoing analysis to refine the specifics of each theme and the overall story of analysis tells, generating clear definitions of the themes and names for each theme. And this then moves us on to the final stage, which is producing a report. And this is a final opportunity for the analysis, selection of vivid, compelling extract examples from the text, final analysis of selected extracts, relating back to the analysis, to the research question and the literature, and producing a scholarly report of the analysis. Just a few words about codes versus themes and the difference. Coded data differs from the units of analysis, i.e. themes, in the sense that it's often broader than codes. The themes are broader than codes. It is possible to code extracts of text in as many different themes as they fit into. So an extract from your text may be uncoded, or coded once, or coded many times to different themes, as is relevant and appropriate to that theme. So coding can be done with a range. With a range of tools, including on the very basic level, using colour pens on paper copies of the text, and then physically cutting up the paper with scissors and organising them into themes. That's a very old style of doing it. You could do the modern equivalent of using Word and highlighting text and cutting and editing and pasting into other documents to collate codes into themes, etc., and start to build your conceptual model. Or in the case of a survey, you could use Excel, which is very simple and easy to use. But you could use that quantitative in interviews as well. But perhaps if you're moving to interviews where you have more text, you might want more specialist qualitative analysis software packages to use those, such as NVivo is an example that we have at the university, and also there are a few copies in the local authority too. As a practical example, we're now going to get you to do some coding. And we're going to look at the citizen survey on electoral cycles. As mentioned, this was a widely published survey across Plymouth that asked people about their views on whether councillors should be continued to be voted in every year for 4 years on a rolling programme across wards in the city, or all at once during a general election year, and then to justify their views through asking a question: why do you think this is the best option? Some explanation on possible pros and cons of each approach were also provided to survey respondents to help them think through their explanations. Over 7,000 people responded to the survey, with nearly 3,700 commenting in the open questions and providing their reasons and thinking. And in the next slide, we provide a snapshot of some of those people's responses, and they're listed in column J in the Excel spreadsheet. So as an exercise, what I want you to do is to read the responses and code the first 10 survey responses, and give yourself 10 minutes to do this. As this is taken from a group-based exercise, you normally would read through the responses yourself and come up with your own codes and then compare these with others in the group as a way of checking whether you are seeing and understanding the same things in the text. Having multiple coders is one way to improve the validity of the analysis. But for the sake of this presentation, you'll need to do this by yourself. So here are those 10 responses, the first 10 responses to the survey. And for each row, make a note of the possible codes for each entry. So these are down the running down the left-hand side here. So these are the first 10 responses. And what I want you to do is take 10 to 15 minutes out to read through those and code through your ideas about the reasons people are providing about why they would prefer a 4-year cycle or an annual cycle, electoral cycle. And in doing that, I want you to think about what code you come up with, and how you might start to, if similar codes are coming up, how you might start to group them together into themes. And have any codes started to repeat in subsequent rows as well as you go through them, so you're seeing similar themes. So have a go at that, and then we'll move on to the next slide, which will have a look at what we managed to do when we had a look at the data and see if you come up with similar things. So let's have a look at the first response only, which says it provides increased political stability, allowing for longer term strategic planning / progression of larger projects. It's a better use of resources, especially when it coincides with a general election / PCC election, close brackets. For each potential code we came up with, we created an extra column to the right of each person's survey response. Here you can see 3 columns that we've added to each with a code in them. Our first one is called effective governance. This relates to the content of the first sentence, which talks about the 4-yearly cycle being better for longer term strategic planning. Our second code, implementation time, is a bit more subtle than the first code in that it refers to the opinion that having elections every 4 years allows for longer term stability and therefore more time to implement projects. Finally, the third code that we came up with was save money. This relates to the respondents' second sentence and their comments about running an election every 4 years as a better use of resources, presumably as they assume that this provides economies of scale. Note that we've used the name save money for our code as we're assuming that this will lead to less money being spent holding one election every 4 years rather than holding 3 elections, a third of the size over 3 years in between a general election. But this is an assumption. So on reflection, a better code name for us might have been to have used the phrase save resources, which is actually more true to the respondents' wording and implies more than financial savings. Finally, you might have noticed that in developing and refining our coding, we decided to create a theme called stability that encompasses both effective governance and implementation time codes. This was because we felt the first 2 codes represented distinct but interrelated ideas. Incidentally, you may have noticed that the column L to N are called coding 1, coding 2, and coding 3, but we could have actually called the columns by the names of the codes and then added 1 or 0 into each cell to indicate the presence or absence of that code. Coding data in this way sometimes makes it easier to manipulate and analyze in Excel. But in truth, there is no right or wrong answer in relation to how you organize your codes in your spreadsheet. And one of the benefits of Excel is that it's a very easy and flexible tool with which to code. Let's now look at some of the coding for the other 9 responses. You can see that Stability 1.2 Effective Governance is a code that appears to be repeated quite often. Here in row 3, 8, and 10, for example. And the code Resources Save Money is now coded across 4 people. But also there are some new emerging codes that also seem to fit into a theme of stability. Stability, consistency of council. These relate to the time to bring ideas together, with the implication being that some councillors change every year, then more time is needed to renegotiate or agree policies or plans as a balance of power changes. In row 8, for example, stability of councillors is related to them being more effective as they are not changing all the time. You can also see that a range of other codes have started to come out, many of them relating to the theme of democracy, with 5 possible child nodes or codes emerging, these relate to the process is simpler for voters, kind of matches general election principles in row 2 and 6. Accountability in row 7. And then you've got in councillors' engagement or visibility, as they don't have to be in touch with electorate. They have to be more in touch with electorate. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Turnout and voter fatigue arising with more frequent elections. And democracy catch-all stroke non-elaborated, which is the sort of roundup category we've created. How did your codes compare to ours? Perhaps you identified similar patterns but called the nodes something else. Did you pick up on a code that is not shown in our example? Do you think you might have reached saturation point? This is the point where you think no more new codes will be identified in the data. So in this slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about reaching saturation and what we mean by that. In this study, as we decided we didn't have enough resources to analyse all 3,700 open questions, we decided to code a random 20% sample, i.e. about 740 responses. In doing this, we arrived at 19 codes, as shown in column A in the table. Within these 19 codes, we grouped 10 codes together in relating to those respondents who wanted to change the system, and 6 codes into those respondents who wanted to keep the existing system. So within the broad categories of change and keep, we grouped together 16 codes into 3 major themes. You can see those, they're called stability, resources, and democracy. It's also interesting to note that we also identified some codes that didn't neatly fall into these bins, if you like. In rows 18 to 20, called the other themes. We created an other theme to capture these and then further separated the codes into those others that advocated change, those that advocated keeping the existing system, and those that stated no preference for either. So, for example, the other no preference theme code contained viewpoints not related to the survey question, such as complaining about car parking arrangements on polling day. As we coded the data in Excel, it meant that we could also easily assess the frequency of different types of code and themes using pivot tables. And you can see the results here in column B of the table. That save money was the most frequent reason people gave. This was in those people who also wanted to change the electoral system to a 4-year cycle. The next most frequent code was in the democracy theme and related to the change resulting from simpler voting systems. You can also see that in those respondents that wanted to keep the existing system, accountability, shown in row 7, was the primary reason given. Interestingly, accountability was also mentioned by 50 respondents in our sample who wanted to change the system, although this was a less common reason than many of the other reasons given by people who wanted change. Also worthy of note that some codes and themes didn't emerge in our data till around row 100, such as voters' fatigue, and row 220, where less purdah emerged, and another theme, others keep theme, also started to emerge. So you can see that we started to reach a saturation point reasonably early on in the data collection. Around a third to halfway through the randomly selected sample, we were not getting any new codes or themes emerging. Thus, after coding 740 respondents, we could be fairly confident we'd captured almost all the different kinds of viewpoints on the pros and cons of returning to a 4-year election cycle or keeping the existing system. That is, we'd reached saturation. So what does good analysis look like in our example of coding an open question in a resident survey? Well, we had multiple codings with the team checking for consistency and non-repetition. So a validation process and also checking for saturation. We had clarity around codes and theme boundaries. We often used a typical quote to illustrate a code or a theme. And sometimes sometimes you can put these into a table with one column showing a theme, the next column a code, and the final column giving an example of a quote that typifies that code, and that would be considered good practice. Did we identify any new or divergent codes or themes that didn't fit within our framework? And did we report on these? Well, this is what we call fair dealing. And so we did identify some codes that fell outside our emerging framework, and these related to the other theme. These were captured and reported on in the final report to councillors. Another category of what a good analysis looks like is developing links between themes and linking to theory. So do our findings challenge theory, and in what way? In our examples, we didn't explicitly set out to do this, but you could see that we could analyse our data in relation to theories of democracy or the democratic process and what they say about accountability, technocratic efficiency, decision-making or effectiveness, for example. So theories around participative, representative, deliberative or pluralist democracy. And finally, in the write-up, did we explain data selection and collection and explore the potential for bias and reflect on our own influence on the data collection and analysis process and how we interpreted the findings, so being reflexive? In our case, the survey was anonymous, but we could have looked at who responded, and based on what they had voluntarily told us about themselves and where they lived in responding to the survey, and decided how representative the viewpoints expressed in the survey might have been of the wider population. That said, as we noted already, in most qualitative work, we're not concerned with representative of viewpoints, but rather the variety of opinions or views. We also need to bear in mind what motivates people to respond to a survey, as this might bias the responses you get. As noted already, this might relate to their experience with council services or with the voting process itself, and also what information was supplied with the survey and how questions were phrased, and if this might have led respondents to answer the questions in a certain way. We know that, for example, information was provided about the financial costs of annual versus four-yearly elections. Have we commented on how this may have influenced how people responded in our report? Finally, we need to reflect on our own assumptions and views in relation to the electoral cycle, and has this unduly influenced how we've interpreted the data in our analysis, and acknowledge this in our final report. So in conclusion, in this presentation we have provided an introduction to some of the key principles and practices of qualitative data analysis. We've looked at what is qualitative data and why it is useful to collect and analyse it. We've briefly explored the nature of qualitative research and how it differs from quantitative research. From this, we looked at what good qualitative analysis looks like and the different approaches commonly used to analyse qualitative data. We've discussed top-down and deductive approaches to analysis, as well as bottom-up and inductive approaches, as well as how to undertake a thematic analysis of qualitative data, and the steps involved in thematic analysis, so familiarization, generating codes and themes, and linking themes to provide a conceptual analysis or framework. Finally, we've had a go at doing coding and thematic analysis using some of the data from the open questions in the Council survey on electoral cycles. Before finally reflecting on what a good analysis and write-up might look like, The principles and practices described in this presentation could be applied to other qualitative data that might be collected or held by the Council, such as interviews or documents. I hope you found this presentation helpful. If you have any queries about qualitative data analysis or evaluation in general, please do get in contact with me or my colleagues in the Health Determinants Research